The Ancient City. A study on the religion, laws, and institutions of Greece and Rome.
Numa Denis Fustel De Coulanges.
Book 3rd, The City. Chapter 7, The Religion of the City. First. The public repasts.
We have already seen that the principal ceremony of the domestic worship was a repast, which they called a sacrifice. To eat food prepared upon an altar was, to all appearance, the first form which men gave to the religious act. The need of putting themselves in communion with the divinity was satisfied by this repast, to which they invited him, and of which they gave him his part. The principal ceremony of the city worship was also a repast of this nature. It was partaken of in common by all the citizens, in honor of the protecting divinities. The celebrating of these public repasts was universal in Greece, and men believed that the safety of the city depended upon their accomplishment. The Odyssey gives us a description of one of these sacred feasts. 9 long tables are spread for the people of Pylos, at each one of them 500 citizens are seated, and each group has immolated 9 bulls in honor of the gods. This repast, which was called the Feast of the Gods, begins and ends with libations and prayers. The ancient custom of repasts in common is also mentioned in the oldest Athenian traditions. It is related that Orestes, the murderer of his mother, arrived at Athens at the very moment when the city, assembled about its king, was performing the sacred act. The public meals of Sparta are well known, but the idea which men ordinarily entertain of them is very far from the truth. They imagine the Spartans living and eating always in common, as if private life had not been known among them. We know, on the contrary, from ancient authors, that the Spartans often took their meals in their own houses, in the midst of their families. The public meals took place twice a month, without reckoning holidays. These were religious acts of the same nature as those which were practiced at Athens, in Argos, and throughout Greece. Besides these immense banquets, where all the citizens were assembled, and which could take place only on solemn festivals, religion prescribed that every day there should be a sacred meal. For this purpose, men chosen by the city, were required to eat together, in its name, within the enclosure of the Prytaneum, in the presence of the sacred fire and the protecting gods. The Greeks were convinced that, if this repast was interrupted but for a single day, the state was menaced with the loss of the favor of its gods. At Athens, the men who took part in the common meal were selected by lot, and the law severely punished those who refused to perform this duty. The citizens who sat at the sacred table were clothed, for the time, with a sacerdotal character. They were called parasites. This word which, at a later period, became a term of contempt, was in the beginning a sacred title. In the time of Demosthenes the parasites had disappeared, but the Prytanes were still required to eat together in the Prytaneum. In all the cities there were halls destined for the common meals. If we observe how matters passed at this meal, we shall easily recognize the religious ceremony. Every guest had a crown upon his head. It was a custom of the ancients to wear a crown of leaves or flowers when one performed a solemn religious act. The more one is adorned with flowers, they said, the surer one is of pleasing the gods, but if you sacrifice without wearing a crown, they will turn from you. A crown, they also said, is a herald of good omen, which prayer sends before it towards the gods. For the same reason the banqueters were clothed in robes of white. White was the sacred color among the ancients, that which pleased the gods. The meal invariably commenced with a prayer and libations, and hymns were sung. The nature of the dishes and the kind of wine that was to be served were regulated by the rules of each city. To deviate in the least from the usage followed in primitive times, to present a new dish or alter the rhythm of the sacred hymns, was a grave impiety, for which the whole city was responsible to the gods. Religion even went so far as to fix the nature of the vessels that ought to be employed both for the cooking of the food and for the service of the table. In one city the bread must be served in copper baskets, in another earthen dishes had to be employed. Even the form of the loaves was immutably fixed. These rules of the old religion continued to be observed, and the sacred meals always preserved their primitive simplicity. Creeds, manners, social condition, all changed, but these meals remained unchangeable, for the Greeks were very scrupulous observers of their national religion. It is but just to add, that when the guests had satisfied the requirements of religion by eating the prescribed food, they might immediately afterwards commence another meal, more expensive and better suited to their taste. This was quite a common practice at Sparta. The custom of religious meals was common in Italy as well as in Greece. It existed anciently, Aristotle tells us, among the peoples known as Enotrians, Oscans, and Ausonians. Virgil has mentioned it twice in the Aeneid. Old Latinus receives the envoys of Aeneas, not in his home, but in a temple, consecrated by the religion of his ancestors. There took place the sacred feasts after the immolation of the victims. There all the family chiefs sat together at long tables. Farther along, when Aeneas arrives at the home of Evander, he finds him celebrating a sacrifice. The king is in the midst of his people, all are crowned with flowers, all, seated at the same table, sing a hymn in praise of the god of the city. This custom was perpetuated at Rome. There was always a hall where the representatives of the curies ate together. The Senate, on certain days, held a sacred repast in the capital. At the solemn festivals, tables were spread in the streets, and the whole people ate at them. Originally the pontiffs presided at these repasts. Later, this care was delegated to special priests, who were called epulones. These old customs give us an idea of the close tie which united the members of a city. Human association was a religion, its symbol was a meal, of which they partook together. We must picture to ourselves one of these little primitive societies, all assembled, or the heads of families at least, at the same table, each clothed in white, with a crown upon his head, all make the libation together, recite the same prayer, sing the same hymns, and eat the same food, prepared upon the same altar. In their midst their ancestors are present, and the protecting gods share the meal. Neither interest, nor agreement, nor habit creates the social bond. It is this holy communion piously accomplished in the presence of the gods of the city.
Second, the festivals and the calendar.
In all ages and in all societies, man has desired to honor his gods by festivals. He has established that there should be days during which the religious sentiment should reign in his soul, without being distracted by terrestrial thoughts and labors. In the number of days that he has to live he has devoted a part to the gods. Every city had been founded with rites which, in the thoughts of the ancients, had had the effect of establishing the national gods within its walls. It was necessary that the virtue of these rites should be rejuvenated each year by a new religious ceremony. This festival they called the birthday. All the citizens were required to celebrate it. Whatever was sacred gave occasion for a festival. There was the festival of the city enclosure, Ambarvalia, and that of the territorial limits, Ambarvalia. On those days the citizens formed a grand procession, clad in white and crowned with leaves. They made the circuit of the city or territory, chanting prayers. At the head walked priests, leading victims, which they sacrificed at the close of the ceremony. Afterwards came the festival of the founder. Then each of the heroes of the city, each of those souls that men invoked as protectors, claimed a worship. Romulus had his, and Servius Tullius, and many others, even to the nurse of Romulus, and Evander's mother. In the same way Athens had the festival of Cecrops, that of Erechtheus, that of Theseus, and it celebrated each of the heroes of the country, the guardian of Theseus, and Eurystheus, and Androgeus, and a multitude of others. There were also the rural festivals, those for plowing, seed time, the time for flowering, and that for the vintage. In Greece, as in Italy, every act of the husbandman's life was accompanied with sacrifices, and men performed their work reciting sacred hymns. At Rome the priests fixed, every year, the day on which the vintage was to commence, and the day on which the new wine might be drunk. Everything was regulated by religion. A religious ordinance required the vines to be pruned, for it told man that it would be impious to offer a libation with the wine of an unpruned vine. Every city had a festival for each of the divinities which it had adopted as a protector, and it often counted many of them. When the worship of a new divinity was introduced into the city, it was necessary to find a new day in the year to consecrate to him. What characterized the religious festivals was the interdiction of labor, the obligation to be joyous, the songs, and the public games. The Athenian religion added, take care to do each other no wrong on those days. The calendar was nothing more than the order of the religious festivals. It was regulated, therefore, by the priests. At Rome it was long before the calendar was reduced to writing. The first day of the month, the pontiff, after having offered a sacrifice, convoked the people, and named the festivals that would take place in the course of the month. This convocation was called the Callatio, whence came the name of calends, which was given to this day. The calendar was regulated neither on the course of the moon nor on the apparent course of the sun. It was governed solely by the laws of religion, mysterious laws, which the priests alone knew. Sometimes religion required that the year should be shortened, and at other times that it should be lengthened. We can form an idea of primitive calendars, if we recollect that among the Albans the month of May had 12 days, and that March had 36. We can see that the calendar of one city would in no wise resemble that of another, since the religion was not the same in both, and the festivals, as well as the gods, were different. The year had not the same length from one city to another. The months did not bear the same names. At Athens they had quite other names than at Thebes, and at Rome they had not the same names as at Lavinium. This was due to the fact that the name of each month was derived, ordinarily, from the principal festival it contained, and the festivals were not the same. Different cities had no understanding to commence the year at the same time, or to count the series of their years from the same date. In Greece the Olympic festival afforded, in the course of time, a common date, but this did not prevent each city from having its own particular style of reckoning. In Italy every city counted its years from the day of its foundation.
Third. The census.
Among the most important ceremonies of the city religion there was one known as the purification. It took place at Athens every year, at Rome it occurred once in 5 years. The rites which were then observed, and the very name which it bore, indicate that the object of this ceremony was to efface the faults committed by the citizens against the worship. Indeed, this religion, with its complicated forms, was a source of terror for the ancients, as faith and purity of intention went for very little, and the religion consisted entirely in the minute practice of innumerable rules. They were always in fear of having been guilty of some negligence, some omission, or some error, and were never sure of being free from the anger or malice of some god. An expiatory sacrifice was necessary, therefore, to reassure the heart of man. The magistrate whose duty it was to offer it, at Rome it was the censor, before the censor, it was the consul, and before the consul, the king, commenced by assuring himself, by the aid of the auspices, that the gods accepted the ceremony. He then convoked the people by means of a herald, who, for this purpose, made use of a certain sacramental formula. All the citizens, on the appointed day, collected outside the walls. There, all being silent, the magistrate walked 3 times around the assembly, driving before him 3 victims, a sheep, a hog, a bull soivatauro. These 3 animals together constituted, among the Greeks, as among the Romans, an expiatory sacrifice. Priests and victims followed the procession. When the 3rd circuit was completed, the magistrate pronounced a set form of prayer, and immolated the victims. From this moment every stain was effaced, all negligence in the worship repaired, and the city was at peace with its gods. 2 things were necessary for an act of this nature, and of so great importance. One was, that no stranger should be found among the citizens, as this would have destroyed the effect of the ceremony. The other was, that all the citizens should be present, without which the city would have retained some stain. It was necessary, therefore, that this religious ceremony should be preceded by a numbering of the citizens. At Rome and at Athens, they were counted with scrupulous care. It is probable that the number was pronounced by the magistrate in the formula of prayer, as it was afterwards inserted in the account of the ceremony which the censor drew up. The loss of citizenship was the punishment of the man who failed to have his name enrolled. This severity is easily explained. The man who had not taken part in the religious act, who had not been purified, for whom the prayer had not been pronounced or the victim sacrificed, could no longer be a member of the city. In the sight of the gods, who had been present at the ceremony, he was no longer a citizen. We are enabled to judge of the importance of this ceremony by the exorbitant power of the magistrate who presided at it. The censor, before commencing the sacrifice, ranged the people in a certain order, the senators, the knights, and the tribes, each rank in its appropriate place. Absolute master on that day, he fixed the place of each man in the different categories. Then, all having been arranged according to his directions, he performed the sacred act. Now, a result of this was, that from that day to the following lustration, every man preserved in the city the rank which the censor had assigned him in the ceremony. He was a senator if on that day he had been counted among the senators, a knight if he had figured among the knights, if a simple citizen, he formed a part of the tribe in the ranks of which he had been on that day, and if the magistrate had refused to admit him into the ceremony, he was no longer a citizen. Thus the place which one had occupied in the religious act, and where the gods had seen him, was the one he held in the city for 5 years. Such was the origin of the immense power of the censor. In this ceremony none but citizens took part, but their wives, their children, their slaves, their property, real and personal, were in a manner purified in the person of the head of the family. It was for this reason that, before the sacrifice each citizen was required to give to the censor an account of the persons and property belonging to him. The lustration was accomplished in Augustus's time with the same exactitude and the same rites as in the most ancient times. The pontiff still regarded it as a religious act, while statesmen saw in it an excellent measure of administration, at least.
Fourth. Religion in the assembly, in the senate, in the tribunal, in the army, in the triumph.
There was not a single act of public life in which the gods were not seen to take a part. As he was under the influence of the idea that they were by turns excellent protectors or cruel enemies, man never dared to act without being sure that they were favorable. The people assembled only on such days as religion permitted. They remembered that the city had suffered a disaster on a certain day. This was, doubtless, because on that day the gods had been either absent or irritated. They would probably be in the same mood at the same season every year, for reasons unknown to mortals. This day, therefore, was forever unlucky. There were no assemblies, no courts, public life was suspended. At Rome, before an assembly proceeded to business, the augurs were required to declare that the gods were propitious. The assembly commenced with a prayer, which the augur pronounced, and which the consul repeated after him. There was the same custom among the Athenians. The assembly always commenced by a religious act. Priests offered a sacrifice, a large circle was then traced by pouring lustral water upon the ground, and within this sacred circle the citizens assembled. Before any orator began to speak, a prayer was pronounced before the silent people. The auspices were also consulted, and if any unfavorable sign appeared in the heavens, the assembly broke up at once. The tribune, or speaker's stand, was a sacred place, and the orator never ascended it without a crown upon his head. The place of assembly of the Roman Senate was always a temple. If a session had been held elsewhere than in a sacred place, its acts would have been null and void, for the gods would not have been present. Before every deliberation, the president offered a sacrifice and pronounced a prayer. In the hall there was an altar, where every senator, on entering, offered a libation, at the same time invoking the gods. The Athenian Senate was little different. The hall also contained an altar and a sacred fire. A religious ceremony was observed at the opening of each session. Every senator, on entering, approached the altar, and pronounced a prayer. While the session lasted, every senator wore a crown upon his head, as in religious ceremonies. At Rome, as well as at Athens, courts of justice were open in the city only on such days as religion pronounced favorable. At Athens the session of the court was held near an altar, and commenced with a sacrifice. In Homer's time the judges assembled, in a holy circle. Festus says, that in the rituals of the Etruscans were directions as to the founding of a city, the consecration of a temple, the arrangement of curies and tribes in a public assembly, and the ranging of an army in order of battle. All these things were marked in the ritual, because all these things were connected with religion. In war, religion was as influential, at least, as in peace. In the Italian cities there were colleges of priests, called fediales, who presided, like the heralds among the Greeks, at all the sacred ceremonies to which international relations gave rise. A fetialis, veiled, and with a crown upon his head, declared war by pronouncing a sacramental formula. At the same time, the consul, in priestly robes, offered a sacrifice, and solemnly opened the temple of the most venerated and most ancient divinity of Italy. Before setting out on an expedition, the army being assembled, the general repeated prayers and offered a sacrifice. The custom was the same at Athens and at Sparta. During a campaign the army presented the image of the city, its religion followed it. The Greeks took with them the statues of their divinities. Every Greek or Roman army carried with it a hearth, on which the sacred fire was kept up night and day. A Roman army was accompanied by augurs and pularii, feeders of the sacred chickens. Every Greek army had a diviner. Let us examine a Roman army at the moment when it is preparing for battle. The consul orders a victim to be brought, and strikes it with the axe. It falls, its entrails will indicate the will of the gods. An aruspex examines them, and if the signs are favorable, the consul gives the signal for battle. The most skillful dispositions, the most favorable circumstances, are of no account if the gods do not permit the battle. The fundamental principle of the military art among the Romans was to be able to put off a battle when the gods were opposed to it. It was for this reason that they made a sort of citadel of their camp every day. Let us now examine a Greek army, and we will take for example the Battle of Plataea. The Spartans are drawn up in line, each one has his post for battle. They all have crowns upon their heads, and the flute players sound the religious hymns. The king, a little in rear of the ranks, slaughters the victims. But the entrails do not give the favorable signs, and the sacrifice must be repeated. 2, 3, 4 victims are successively immolated. During this time the Persian cavalry approach, shoot their arrows, and kill quite a number of Spartans. The Spartans remain immovable, their shields placed at their feet, without even putting themselves on the defensive against the arrows of the enemy. They await the signal of the gods. At last the victims offer the favorable signs, then the Spartans raise their shields, seize their swords, move on to battle, and are victorious. After every victory they offer a sacrifice, and this is the origin of the triumph, which is so well known among the Romans, and which was not less common among the Greeks. This custom was a consequence of the opinion which attributed the victory to the gods of the city. Before the battle the army had addressed a prayer to them, like the one we read in Aeschylus.
To you, O gods, who inhabit and possess our land, if our arms are fortunate, and if our city is saved, I promise to sprinkle your altars with the blood of sheep, to sacrifice bulls to you, and to hang up in your holy temples the trophies conquered by the spear.
By virtue of this promise, the victor owed a sacrifice. The army entered the city to offer it, and repaired to the temple, forming a long procession, and singing a sacred hymn.
Θρίαμβος.
At Rome the ceremony was very nearly the same. The army marched in procession to the principal temple of the city. The priests walked at the head of the cortege, leading victims. On reaching the temple, the general sacrificed the victims to the gods. On their way the soldiers all wore crowns, as was becoming in a sacred ceremony, and sung a hymn, as in Greece. There came a time, indeed, when the soldiers did not scruple to replace the hymn, which they did not understand, by baroque songs and raillery at their general, but they still preserved the custom of repeating the refrain.
Io trionfai.
Indeed, it was this refrain which gave the name to the ceremony. Thus, in time of peace, as in war time, religion intervened in all acts. It was everywhere present, it enveloped man. The soul, the body, private life, public life, meals, festivals, assemblies, tribunals, battles, all were under the empire of this city religion. It regulated all the acts of man, disposed of every instant of his life, fixed all his habits. It governed a human being with an authority so absolute that there was nothing beyond its control. One would have a very false idea of human nature to believe that this ancient religion was an imposture, and, so to speak, a comedy. Montesquieu pretends that the Romans adopted a worship only to restrain the people. A religion never had such an origin, and every religion that has come to sustain itself only from motives of public utility, has not stood long. Montesquieu has also said that the Romans subjected religion to the state. The contrary is true. It is impossible to read many pages of Livy without being convinced of this. Neither the Romans nor the Greeks knew anything of those sad conflicts between church and state which have been so common in other societies. But this is due solely to the fact that at Rome as well as at Sparta and Athens, the state was enslaved by its religion, or, rather, the state and religion were so completely confounded, that it was impossible even to distinguish the one from the other, to say nothing of forming an idea of a conflict between the two,